Upper canine bracketing. Bracketing the upper canine is much more complicated than the incisors because the tooth, first of all, is asymmetric. The mesial aspect of the crown here, the edge is smaller than the distal. It has a much more rounded shape. It's much more difficult to find the midline of the tooth, and actually the correct bracketing technique for the canine is to bracket it slightly mesially and try to find out, or with a panoramic x-ray, to find its axis, its long axis. So it's much more complicated. So the tooth can be, and also it starts to be in the corner of the mouth, which you have some parallax effect. So the correct height in the Roth prescription is 4.5 millimeters, which is roughly here. If you go for an MBT again, you have to add 1 millimeter, which brings the canine bracket very close to the gingiva, almost touching the gingiva. It's the same again, but it's much more complicated to understand the torque aspect of this tooth because of its angulation. So the first thing we need to do is to ensure that the bracket is actually slightly more mesial than the central incisors, because you want to make sure that the tooth is going to be rotated correctly. So you can play a bit with the mesial aspect. You also can play with the angulation if you feel that the tooth should be slightly more angulated. Let's say you want the root more distal, you can also incisize that the bracket will never be parallel to the tip of the canine because there is no edge on this canine. So you can play with this, but you also have to remember that the more tip you add or more angulation you add will have some severe consequences if you want to retract the canines. We'll discuss this in another session. So that's why sometimes you're better off minimizing the amount of tip on the canines during the initial part of treatment to avoid some unfavorable side effects while you are retracting canines or aligning the canines. In summary, you can see that the canines should be slightly more mesial because the tooth is not symmetrical. The mesial aspect of the crown is shorter here than here. The tooth is more rounded, and let me explain what will tend to give us as a problem. So if you look at the canine right here, the bracket has some torque in the base, and it's pretty obvious that if we change the position of the bracket towards the gingiva, the torque will be vastly different than if we move it towards the incisal edge. So the positioning of the bracket is pretty complicated by the fact that first, it's not a symmetrical tooth. It is more rounded. You cannot really position it in the center of the tooth. So it's almost an art to position these canines because they tend to bring unfavorable side effects if the bracketing is not done correctly. Requires a fair amount of experience.